Nuclear arsenal is just 20 miles northwest of Seattle at Naval Base Kitsap. KIRO 7's Deborah Horn is looking in depth at why what happened in the other Washington matters so much here. And Deborah, one reason it matters is because there are thousands of Russians who live here.
In fact, Sydney, we met many of them right here on 6th Avenue in downtown Seattle. The sudden closing of the Russian consulate came when many of them need it most.
We wake up, we open Facebook, and we see news that the Russian consulate in Seattle is closing down.
We met Alex Bendatov, his wife and children outside the Russian consulate in downtown Seattle. They rushed here hoping to pick up their young son's passport for their trip back home to Russia this summer.
It was just like a big surprise.
The announcement came early this morning. The United States is expelling 60 Russian intelligence officers at the United Nations and the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C., and closing the Russian consulate in Seattle. Everyone working here to be reassigned. More than a dozen allies joining together to punish Moscow's alleged role in poisoning an ex-spy in Britain. The breadth of the decision catching even the experts off guard.
Closing Seattle is quite a big step. So yes, that did surprise me.
But former CNN Moscow bureau chief Jill Doherty says she is not surprised that the Puget Sound region is caught in this controversy stretching across the world.
No. In fact, this would be one of the first places, if you were in Russia, that I'm sure is targeted in a potential nuclear war. There's no question. Because of the submarines carrying nuclear weapons that are based here. That's obvious.
Obvious because just 20 miles northwest of Seattle is stored a significant portion of the nation's nuclear arsenal at Naval Base Kitsap.
Its move against the consulate is appropriate.
Democratic Congressman Derek Kilmer represents Kitsap County. Appropriate why?
Well, so we have national security assets. A submarine-based Bangor was called out by the administration as part of the rationale behind that move. Obviously, the Boeing company is a very important company. We know that the Russians have engaged in espionage, including corporate espionage.
Still, Jill Doherty says none of it bodes well for U.S.-Russia relations.
In fact, I would say there's a complete absence of trust between these two countries. And that gets very, very dangerous because these are two nuclear-armed countries.
As for the Bendatov family, they did manage to get their son's passport, but they need many more documents before they can fly home to Russia.
Like the common people, they're the ones who will have to suffer as a result of this. And it's just going to make life more difficult for everybody.
In fact, now the nearest Russian consulate is in Houston, Texas, some 1,900 miles away. Simney?
Jill Doherty actually lives and works here at the University of Washington now. Does she think we have to worry about Russia retaliating against us around here because of the president's move?
Simney, she says she does not believe that Russia wants to go to war with the U.S. So in that sense, we are safe. But she says that these are now two really important countries not communicating with each other. And she says that could lead to dangerous misunderstandings that could go in a direction that no one wants. So in other words, stay tuned.
All right, and we will be. Deborah Horn reporting live from downtown Seattle. Thank you for that.
Now, this closure is going to have a major impact across the country because there are only 4 locations in the entire United States. The embassy is in Washington, D.C. The consulates are in New York, Houston, and, until today, Seattle. And the Russian consulate in Seattle serves people across a huge swath of the U.S. It covers 14 states and handles everything from visas and passports to adoption paperwork.
Seattle is at the center of an international conflict tonight, and the story seems like it was ripped right out of a James Bond movie. Russian diplomats being kicked out of 21 countries, including the United States. On top of that, the Trump administration is shutting down the Russian consulate in Seattle, a consulate that serves Russians in 14 Western states.
The president wants to work with Russia, but their actions sometimes don't allow that to happen.
This worldwide condemnation comes weeks after Moscow was accused of trying to kill a former spy living in the UK. His daughter also poisoned. The UK says the Russians used a deadly nerve agent.
They kill people the same way insecticides kill bugs, because they're the same class of compounds.
This was the last Russian consulate open on the West Coast. Good evening, I'm Marnie Hughes.
And I'm David Rose. The White House says it's being closed because officials believed it was a key headquarters for Russian intelligence officers gathering information on the United States. The Trump administration also says the consulate's location in downtown Seattle was too close to sensitive military targets like Boeing and the nuclear submarines at Naval Base Kitsap. The announcement was a shock this morning for the tens of thousands of Russian immigrants living in the Northwest. They're now left wondering where they'll go to get passports, visas, and more. Simone Del Rosario spoke with a Russian immigrant who says closing the consulate is just punishing the common folk.
Valeria Kulakova is a Seattle pastry chef, a Russian, and a proud member of Washington's international community.
We're trying to contribute to the community we live, but it's still, we don't want to be cut out from where we grew up. It's part of our culture.
But that's exactly what she says is happening with the U.S. government's closure of Seattle's Russian consulate.
I don't think everybody who works there is involved in anything.
It's a consulate that serves many thousands of people across much of the western U.S.
That was the worst news this morning when I woke up. I travel back to Russia almost every year just to visit my other family, go back for the summer. And I have to renew my passport every 5 years, just like everybody else. And now I think the closest one is in Houston.
She worries about her grandparents not being able to travel to the consulate to collect their pensions, and the immigrants who need to go home to visit sick relatives.
We need the consulate because there are so many of us here who are needed for all the visa, passport issues, and just common kind of help if anything happens. And we don't think about Boeing and the Navy and the submarines.
But because of Boeing and submarines and an attack on a former Russian spy, this closure means an uncertain future for tens of thousands of Russian immigrants. In Seattle, Simone Del Rosario, Q13 News.
So the closing of the consulate will have a major impact on our entire Russian community in Western Washington.
Tadevik Aprikyan is here to shed some light on this. So Tadevik, how big is that community and how many people will be affected?
Well, there's a very large Russian population here in Western Washington, and Seattle is home to major tech companies and medical research centers that recruit and employ Russian citizens. All of those people use this consulate to renew paperwork they need. And now that it's closed, people in the Russian community say it's going to create a lot of problems for them.
Sergei
Gladish moved to the U.S. from Moscow 18 years ago.
I've been visiting this consulate for on many occasions to get my passport renewed. I know my American friends would visit it to get the Russian visa.
We caught up with him today as he was picking up paperwork from the Russian consulate in Seattle just before it closed.
I believe it sends the wrong signal to our community in general in terms of how the U.S. government even perceives us. Why would they close down a consulate that's very helpful to us?
Gladish runs a nonprofit called the Russian-American Cooperation Initiative. He says closing the consulate is a blow to his work, trying to better U.S.-Russia relations and help reduce what he calls Russophobia, the anti-Russian rhetoric that's rising.
We really did have hope that with Trump in office, relations between U.S. and Russia would improve.
He says that hope is hard to see with moves like this. The Russian consulate in Seattle is important to a lot of people, serving 14 western states. Former Deputy National Security Advisor Steve Yates says closing the Seattle consulate will have significant impact on the local community, but globally, the impact is minimal.
This is probably more theatrics than substance in terms of the impact.
The White House says, among other things, the move had to do with the consulate's proximity to one of the nation's submarine bases and Boeing.
Those Russian diplomats could be watching what's going on in our tech firms, could be watching what's going on in our aerospace industries, and as well as our military engagement back and forth.
Yates says it's hard to know whether the consulate closure and expulsion of diplomats is the main move from the White House to show solidarity with its allies after Russia allegedly poisoned a British spy, or whether there will be more to come.
I don't think I should be the person affected.
Either way, Gladish says it will have an impact on his community, and although he's disappointed, he'll find other ways to help the two countries he's called home get along. Yates had another interesting point that other countries who've closed consulates have looked for ways to supplement that physical presence with an online presence, but he says that'll be difficult for Russians to do given the recent events around Russia's online meddling.
So it's clear that people wanting to get passports or visas are going to be impacted. Are there other major areas that could see some changes as a result of this?
Academics, especially for students who are going to Russia for any sort of cultural exchanges. And then there's also international adoption. A lot of Americans adopt Russian children, and although new adoptions from Russia are banned right now, Yates says this will make it very difficult for families who are already in that process or ones that hope to go through it in the future.
So many people impacted. All right, Todorovic, we'll stay on that. In the meantime,
hello. Australia has become the latest country to throw out Russian diplomats, part of the biggest mass expulsion since the end of the Cold War. In total, 24 countries, including the United States and 16 European nations, have united in response to the nerve agent attack in Salisbury. The Russian government says officially the expulsions are a mistake and it will respond in the coming days. More on the latest from Australia in a moment. First, our diplomatic correspondent, James Robbins.
Sometimes size really does matter. And this diplomatic action against Russia by Western democracies is unprecedented in its scale. On their own, the American expulsions are remarkable, 60 Russians being ordered out by the White House, a new record in the post-Cold War world. France, Germany and Poland, each kicking 4 Russians out, top the list of European government action. More than half all EU states are expelling, backing Britain with action, not just words. NATO ally Canada is also clearing out some Russians, as is one of President Putin's largest victims, Ukraine, and the list may get longer. The Prime Minister could hardly have hoped for more. She told the Commons it was the largest collective expulsion of Russian intelligence officers in history.
I have found great solidarity from our friends and partners in the EU, North America, NATO and beyond over the past 3 weeks as we have confronted the aftermath of the Salisbury incident. And together we have sent a message that we will not tolerate Russia's continued attempts to flout international law and undermine our values.
3 weeks after the Salisbury attack, as the investigation goes on and warnings to those who were in the area at the time remain in place, the diplomatic heat on President Putin is being turned up again. In Brussels, the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, said today's EU action could even be extended quite quickly.
Additional measures, including further expulsions within the common EU framework, are not to be excluded in the coming days and weeks.
Today's action has its roots in years of alleged Russian misbehaviour. From President Putin's annexation of Crimea, judged illegal by most of the outside world, through armed intervention in eastern Ukraine to destabilise the country, to accusations of Kremlin fingerprints on a catalogue of cyber attacks against the West, combined with abuse of social media and plots to undermine elections and democracy in Europe and the United States. Russia's immediate reaction?
What the United States of America are doing today is destroying what little remains in terms of Russian-American relations. I'd like to add that the entire responsibility for the consequences of that destruction lies on America.
Tonight I asked the Foreign Secretary why so many countries had been willing to act together.
The reason why you've seen this outpouring of revulsion at what Russia has done is because so many other countries in the last 10 years have now experienced provocations of one kind or another. They've had disruption of their elections, cyber warfare, all kinds of Russian aggression and malign behaviour.
Are you braced for whatever retaliation Russia chooses? They might go, mightn't they, to cyber warfare?
Well, let's be very clear. It's not just we who are obviously braced, and we have every possible protection and precaution that we've taken, but it's our friends and partners, knowing that they probably will face now some kind of retaliation from Russia. And that for me is all the more impressive, that they've chosen to do it nonetheless.
Moscow is sticking with denial. Russian retaliation is inevitable. The crisis triggered by attempted murder in Salisbury continues to grow at a startling pace. James Robbins, BBC News.
And Australia's Prime Minister has been explaining in strong terms why his country is the latest to take action.
The brazen attack, the criminal attack in the United Kingdom, in Salisbury, on the 4th of March, was an attack on all of us. It was an attack on the sovereignty of every nation that respects the rule of law, and that is why we are taking this action today. With another 23 nations around the world, we are defying this recklessness, this lawlessness of Russia, and expressing in solidarity with the United Kingdom and other nations that share those values that we will not tolerate this type of reckless undermining of international law, this reckless assault on the sovereignty of nations.
Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, our correspondent in Sydney, Hal Griffith, gave us his assessment of the speech.
Australia isn't the first to take action, but it wants to make very, very clear whose side it's on, and it wants to show solidarity with Theresa May and all those other countries. And the language Malcolm Turnbull was using there, accusing Russia of recklessness, of lawlessness, and he actually listed a list of alleged crimes by Russia. So meddling in Brexit, trying to undermine the presidential elections in France, in Catalonia, in the US, a big list of crimes by Malcolm Turnbull accusing Russia of being guilty of them. And earlier on, when the expulsions were made, again he said that the attack in Salisbury was part of a pattern by Russia that was threatening to a threat to global security.
Hal Griffith for us in Sydney there.